If I can get it from there.
There you go. Side.
Oh. Okay. So hi, I'm going to be using my notes for today, so forgive me. But I'm really actually excited to be included in this conversation to talk to you guys about positive news and constructive journalism. And although I'm speaking to you as future journalists, I actually came into this conversation from the perspective of the consumer. And we've heard everybody sort of mentioning how important the consumer is in producing the content that you'll eventually start making. So I was a consumer, well, I am a consumer myself, and I actually found the news to be too depressing. So even though I've always had a really keen interest in politics and more generally just being informed on what's going on in the world, I actually began to not want to watch the news. And this really, really concerned me, because if I'm actually motivated to know, but I'm attracted to the idea of choosing ignorance, I actually wondered how many people felt the same. And I thought, what would it take to keep me informed in a way that kept me engaged? So instead of switching off, I actually began to read a lot more widely, to kind of seek out some sort of balance. And in doing so, I was inspired. And as was mentioned earlier, I began a website called whatagoodweek.com, and that was an aggregation of what I considered to be good news stories published through various news outlets. And this wasn't with the aim for or advocating for a wholly good news newspaper, but it was to provide myself the balance that I felt was lacking. And it was a way to actually keep me engaged in the mainstream narrative. So since then, I was really encouraged by how many people were actually involved in the conversation of good news. And I've started a master's degree to research the psychological consequence of reading the news. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. But if you're interested in writing techniques or how to pitch to an industry, then this is available through the Constructive Journalism project. So in this talk, we're going to look at what constructive journalism is, what it's not, why it's actually important, what the psychological and sociological effects are, who's doing it already, and how. And I've got about 20 minutes to get through that, so I'm going to race through it fairly quickly. But to begin with, we have to ask, why is it actually important to understand the psychological consequences? Well, most fundamentally, the reason is because it does have consequences. The news media provide a powerful stream of information which we as readers inescapably consume. And the news connects us to events that we're unable to experience firsthand, as well as help us make sense of those that we are actually able to experience. So these stories that journalists tell us or choose not to tell us about society and its participants are going to influence the reader's understanding of the world, and it's going to help shape our opinions and our beliefs. And the process of influence is largely explained by first-level and second-level agenda setting, which suggests that the media not only tell us what to think about, but they actually tell us how we should think about it. So the what becomes really important. What are we reporting? What are we actually bringing to the attention of the public? And what are we not reporting? So it's suggested that the more someone is exposed to an issue, the more important they consider it to be. And just to demonstrate the power of exposure, I'd just like to bring your attention to a multi-billion-pound industry that entirely relies on it, and that's advertising. I realise my logo is maybe slightly out of date, but I think that you kind of get the point. So the fact that you are able to recall logo sayings kind of illustrates how easy it is to voluntarily or involuntarily pay attention to the information around you and learn from it. And then you have the second level agenda setting theory, and this is the how. How is it being reported? How is the information being presented? And in what way is it being told to the public? Because this is going to determine how people actually think about the issue. So rather than explain this, I thought that I'd show you with a little demonstration. So I'm going to show you some raw data, and I'd like you to tell me, you have 10 seconds to do it, but I'd like you to count how many geometric shapes there are on this picture, and then just shout out at the end. So you have 10 seconds. Okay, so does anyone want to hazard a guess as to how many pictures were actually on there, how many shapes? Anyone feel free to shout out. 10? 12? Anyone higher or lower? 88. Wow, that's actually, okay, so the answer was 83, so that was quite close, whoever said that. And for everyone that knew it was 83 but just decided to keep it to yourselves, that's absolutely fine as well. But can anybody tell me what colour was the bowling ball that was at the bottom of the screen? Purple, well done. I wasn't expecting you to say that, but yes. And can anybody tell me how many children there were on the school bus? Or how many musical notes there were coming off the keyboard? Okay. So the purple ball was right, but the other two questions were wrong. And but what this is sort of trying to demonstrate was that reality is going to provide journalists with raw data to write a story about. So where we place our focus is going to actually determine what details are selected, and that's ultimately going to sculpt the story that we tell. But what's really exciting about journalism, or what I think is really exciting about journalism, is there isn't just one story to be told in just one way. As journalists, you do have the power to choose what to focus on. So by me asking you to pay attention to how many geometric shapes, you place your attention there and you kind of systematically ignore everything else. So what constructive journalism is about widening the lens to actually include details that could be ignored. And there was a photographer at the National Geographic, Stuart Jones, and he was given a really interesting focus. Every time he was sent out on a shoot, he was instructed to find pictures that celebrate what's right with the world, rather than wallow in what's wrong with it. And this really created a powerful shift that sort of changed his entire career. And he found that beauty emerged in the most unlikely of places, and a different but equally valid experience of reality was shared with his readers. So this example isn't to say that we should only report on what's right with the world, but it does demonstrate the possibilities available to you as journalists through the questions that you ask. So we have the what, and we have the how. And the what refers to content. So when we're talking about positive content, it's considered to be rigorous journalism that reports critically on tangible progress being made in order for us to learn about how issues are being dealt with. And typically this includes stories of innovation, initiative, peace building, progress, solutions, achievements, and positive aspects of society. And then we have the how, and the how relates to the approach. So when we talk about positive approach, we refer to it as constructive journalism. So just to make the distinction, constructive journalism is not necessarily positive news. It's a positive approach to reporting the news, regardless of the subject. So constructive journalism is quite an important area that's emerged within journalism. And it embraces the idea that there isn't just positive or negative. In fact, most stories have elements of the two. And it recognises that it's important to widen the lens to include both of these. So it does report on the problem, but then it goes one step further to look at what solutions are being implemented. And then you can get critical about the solutions. Are they working? In what way are they doing it? Can it be replicated? Is the problem here the same as it is there? And can we learn from these solutions? So by including these solutions as part of the picture, it makes the reader aware of the possibilities and options. It doesn't just leave them stuck with the problem. And whether they use these solutions as emulation or perhaps for inspiration, it provides them with some sort of information about a way forward. And it's the inclusion of both problems and solutions that's important in helping the reader have an in-depth understanding of an issue. So this balance is really useful in creating context, and it helps the reader understand what the story means, its impact, the failings, the opportunities, our personal proximity to it, and informs us on an individual level what we can actually do. So, theoretically speaking, from an academic perspective, constructive journalism has been an evident success for the last 36 years. And it was first termed by a gentleman called Jack Haskins, who was a professor at the University of Tennessee. Practically speaking, however, it's a much more recent approach to reporting, pioneered by organisations like Constructive Journalism Project in the UK, Solutions Journalism Network in the US, and again in the US, Transformative Journalism Initiative. And it's also supported by hugely influential organisations within journalism, like the Knight Foundation. So one final note is that it's important to mention that it's not enough to simply present the problem and the solution to be considered constructive. It's very much about how we actually tell these stories of problems and solutions to make sure that we empower the reader. So this refers to having empathy and compassion when reporting problems, pushing past the most obvious, gruesome or tragic details of a story to include a more balanced reflection of what the reality actually looks like. And it refers to reporting critically on solutions, so not overstating their importance, and reporting more on the process of progress rather than the actual person instigating it. So now we've had a brief look at what it is, let's just take a quick look at what it's not. So positive news has had a slightly unfair reputation because it has been, in my opinion, it's been misrepresented by the mainstream media, who've often sidelined it to be an and finally at the end of the news, showing light-hearted, soft stories that bear very little weight to the central narrative, like our good friend here, the water skiing squirrel. So just to reiterate quickly, it's not fluff, it's not forced, it's not unimportant happy stories, and it's not escapism. Reporting positive news doesn't seek to undermine the presence of problems by sugarcoating them, nor is it about being ignorant or in denial of problems, or to give you a full sense of security. It's actually about adding to the narrative, not replacing it. And lastly, positive news isn't PR or it's not propaganda. PR serves a commercial purpose where positive news serves a social one. So it's not trying to push or plug anything. So there's been 3 reasons that constructive journalism has become increasingly popular. And the first is the rise has been the result of actually trying to counteract the negativity bias within the media to restore a sense of balance and perspective. So there's a common phrase in the newsroom, which I'm sure you'll hear among your career, called "if it bleeds, it leads." And the news has become increasingly negative over the past 3 decades. So in terms of content, the evidence suggests that stories most commonly considered newsworthy focus on war, corruption, scandal, murder, famine, and natural disasters. And they're chosen over positive content for publication and given preferential display, even when other news values are the same. And just whilst I've been here actually today, listening to the other speakers, and also sort of watching the videos, every sort of example of the story, and this was probably because I was paying attention to it, but was a fairly negative one, except for the festival in Hull. Other than that, they were all examples of negative, and that sort of shows just how entrenched it is in the culture, even at the beginning of your careers and training. In terms of context, there's also a negativity bias. So there was an experiment conducted by Boyle, and he concluded this by writing a negative version and a positive version of 10 different news stories with exactly the same content. And the negative version was selected in almost every case by industry professionals in terms of preference and importance. So this negativity bias has been identified to have detrimental psychological impacts on the readers, and we're going to touch on that in a moment. But the readers who felt that the news was too negative and experienced adverse feelings as a result were actually highly motivated to read positive news in an effort to counteract this, very much like myself. So it became clear that reading positive news not only reduces the detrimental psychological consequences associated with reading predominantly negative content, but it actually actively promotes more positive responses. Some people worry that if you only hear good news, you're going to miss out on a lot of important things. But what my research shows is that often people don't just read positive news on its own. They usually read it in addition to the mainstream media. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about now isn't through sort of a skewed, naive, blissful state of awareness. It's actually about having a balance within the mainstream narrative. But without this balance, the excess of negative news has been connected to the following. So the first is an inappropriate assessment of risk. So the over-representation of problems can make people think that the world is actually more dangerous than it is. And with 24-hour news coverage on TV and online, this inescapable sense of risk can lead to personal anxiety. So this anxiety created by the news doesn't just exist out there, but it actually becomes more personal. And it's been shown that watching just 14 minutes of negative news continuously can increase anxiousness, sadness, and increase a tendency to catastrophize personal worry. Now, a lot of this anxiety is actually the result of feeling disempowered by what you've been reading. It's been identified to leave the reader feeling small, isolated, powerless, and helpless. So this feeling that the world's facing an imminent threat, combined with a sense of lack of control, of course that is going to make you feel pretty anxious. So what it showed was reading positive news actually reduced this feeling of anxiety by giving some perspective, making people aware of specific developments and initiatives, and shows that there can be effective resolve and progress in response to problems. And this creates a sense of possibility, which also infiltrates the reader on a more personal level. And it's identified to help foster a feeling of empowerment and self-efficacy, where they actually believe that their actions are able to make a difference, should they be moved to do so. And this is really important to draw attention to, because one of the main purposes of the news is to engage and inform citizens in a way that empowers them to be able to act on the information presented. The American Press Institute embraces this by defining the ultimate role of the news to empower the informed. Well, if this sense of possibility creates a feeling of empowerment as a result from the information they're presented with, then including positive news is serving one of the most fundamental purposes of the news. And then we look at, well, what are we doing by leaving it out? So by having predominantly negative news, it can instead create a feeling of hopelessness and pessimism. One reader that I was interviewing for my research said, when you read only negative news, and it's only negative, you just come away feeling very kind of, well, everything is terrible, that everything is kind of hopeless. So this is important again, because if you're hopeless and you think that the future looks bleak, you may not actually do anything in response to these problems that you're presenting. Because even if you care, if you don't believe that you're able to affect change, you may not even bother trying. So positive news shows that not everything is terrible. Some things are terrible. But the problem doesn't always need to be the verdict. It doesn't need to be the end point of the story. We can then look at what else is happening. Look at how this issue is being addressed. And that may offer some hope for the situation. So readers identified positive news not only to reduce this feeling of hopelessness and pessimism, but generally said that it restored or increased a feeling of hope and optimism, both of which are really important for mobilizing human potential to persevere and problem solve. Because if you believe that eventual success is possible, you are going to keep trying despite difficulties. And with so many problems and challenges facing the world, optimism is a really important resource in helping us actually become energized enough to address these problems constructively. So just to reiterate, the purpose of positive news or constructive journalism is not to report a life without challenge, but instead to recognize that this crisis can be a starting point for growth, and that should be included as part of the story. So another big problem with the excess of negativity is a lack of engagement. And as a writer, this is probably going to be the most important point for you, because if you write a piece, a really important piece,